Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Time for our final panel now. And we're going to have a look at active travel, and specifically the prospect of hitting the government's target that 50% of urban trips will be walked, wheeled or cycled by 2030. And we have, of course, an illustrious panel, including Xavier Bryce, Chief Executive of Sustrans, Christina Calderato, Director of Transport Strategy and Policy at Transport for London, Richard Dilks, Chief Executive of Como UK, which is the national charity for shared transport, which includes bike, e-bike and e-scooter schemes. And finally, we also have Steve Norris. We heard from him right at the start of the event yesterday. Steve, of course, now is an independent transport and property advisor. But while Steve was a transport minister in the 1990s, Steve says he introduced what was then a new concept within the department, that walking and cycling are actually modes of transport and should be within the DfT's remit. Now, Steve has told me that he wants to play devil's advocate, so I'm going to duck out of this one, hand it over to Steve, and watch the fireworks. Our panel, everybody.
Thanks very much, Nicola. I'm not sure this thing is working. Can you hear me? Yeah, good. Not quite devil's advocate, but this whole panel, reminds me of a time when I was minister, and John Grimshaw, who, of course, founded Sustrans, as Xavier will know, asked if he could make a presentation to me about cycling. And I said, yeah, it's quite interesting, let's do it. So with a group of my officials, we walked over from the department to the civil engineers where the presentation was going to take place. And John made this presentation, which was, just incredibly attractive and logical and simple. I mean, here was this proposition that if you cycled, it was quite healthy. You certainly weren't emitting any emissions of any sort. You weren't taking up a huge amount of road space. You could go wherever you liked. And so it seemed to me to be, quite a good idea. I mean, I could cycle. Like all kids of my age, we cycled because that was how you got around. So, as we walked back to the department, I remember saying to my officials at the time, why don't we do more about cycling? And the lead official said, well, the thing is, Minister, not many people cycle. And I thought, yeah, that's like the shop that doesn't sell tomatoes. People go in and say, you've got any tomatoes? And say, no, I don't sell tomatoes. If you'd actually sold some tomatoes, people might come in and ask for them, and you could say yes, So I said, maybe we should do something about cycling. Maybe we should promote it. And so I actually authored, and it's still there if you're going to have a look, the first national cycling strategy, which said, let's go from zero to something. And set what was then a modest target, got given 5 million by the department to do this, I might tell you, for the whole of the country, which was not a lot. And so, we started, I sometimes feel as if I'm like Dr. Frankenstein, kind of invented this monster that is now the cycling lobby, some of whose extreme views, I have to say, I have not the slightest interest in, but nonetheless, fascinating that now, with the second iteration of the government's sort of cycling infrastructure strategy, we're seeing a commitment to doubling cycle numbers from where they are now, more children walking to school, all of this good, very good, healthy stuff, kind of stuff that Richard's doing. I remember when I went to Scotland to see the very first shared car scheme, which was run as a charity, because the assumption is you never make any money out of it. That was 20 years ago. Now, we all are facing, I think, a very different proposition, because apart from anything else, we have climate change, we have emissions, we have all of those issues around the problems that are presented by 25% of all of our carbon emissions coming from the transport sector, and of course, principally, that means from cars. And so the challenge now for me is very straightforward. It's utterly admirable that we should get more people to cycle. It's great that we should plan for more cycling provision, which is great. The kind of money that's going in now is wonderful. And it's great that we've got a sector, a shared use sector, which goes way beyond just the idea of the car club and is much more developed. Problem for me, slightly, is that all of this comes with a rather heavy anti-car kind of, sort of thought process behind it. I mean, I even saw on your website, Richard, that it talks about restraining car use. Restraining is an interesting word to use. I mean, maybe showing people better alternatives, cheaper, better, more sustainable. Restraining. I think you look at what TfL is doing with things like LTNs and ULEZ extension and so on, 20's plenty even, and it's sort of got this real sense of being anti-car. And Xavier, you've made no secret of the fact that you think the war can only be won, if I put it in that way. Well, maybe we wouldn't put it that way, but I want to put words in his mouth if I possibly can. Where, in a sense, you're saying we've got to do something about reducing car use and by making car use less attractive. So what I wanted to get out of this session is, how do we make progress with something that's admirable, but at the same time do it with public opinion being on side? Because if you just piss too many people off, then a good idea gets killed simply because people aren't prepared to accept it. So I'd be really interested in both what my three panelists think and then maybe in the debate that we can follow. Xavier, do you sort of take it on from there?
Sure.
Restraining car use.
Thank you, Steve. Why don't I start with that? So can everyone hear me? Is my mic on? No. Okay. Oh, it is now. Yeah, great. Thank you. So I guess the reason I picked you up on the use of the word war is actually, I think, the language and the polarization around this is really unhelpful, and and I agree with your point that we've got to bring people with us on this, and it's really difficult. So I think that's the first point. To go to sort of it's about being anti-car, it's about restraining car. Well, fundamentally, it's not. What it's about is it's about choice. Yeah, I imagine we agree on that. But in order to get to a position where people can choose, people tend to choose what's easy. There's surveys of why do people cycle in Copenhagen. Some people cycle because it's cheap, some because it's environmentally friendly, some because most people cycle in Copenhagen because it's the easiest way to get around.
Yep.
So people do what's easy. Now, there are arguments in order to you need to make it hard for people to drive so they do what's easy. But I'd start before that, which is we spent the last 60 to 70 years making it facilitating the motor car. And that has had unintended consequences. And that means now that it is not, people do not feel safe to cycle, it is not easy to cycle, it is hard to walk down residential streets, let alone wheel down them in a wheelchair or in a mobility scooter because of parked cars. Therefore, we need to restrain parking on pavements. Therefore, we need to reallocate road space, not in order to punish car use, but effectively to redress the balance to achieve a level playing field. And I think that's the fundamental point. You're dealing, unfortunately, with finite space. And therefore, in order to enable choice and enable people to do what's easy, you do need to fundamentally change the priority given to cars. And that is politically really difficult. And that point of change is really hard. But there's ample evidence from across the world, certainly across Europe, and here in the UK, that once you get through that, actually, the change does happen. But that change is really challenging.
I mean, just on the things that you've mentioned, the one that strikes me as being deliverable and, if you like, will become acceptable is simply reducing car parking spaces, on-road parking. I mean, it's interesting, in the City of London, almost nobody drives to a location in the City of London because they know there's absolutely nowhere to park. And whether they like that or not, whether if you said, would you love to be able to park outside the office, I'm sure people would say yes. The fact of the matter is they've already assimilated it. And you see, because I absolutely understand what you're saying. I'm sure everybody in this room understands that the last 70 years have been devoted to the motor car, and it's brought an enormous number of benefits, but that we've now got to persuade people to go to that different view of why I use my car and what I use it for. I often think in London, where we've got, I think, the best integrated public transport system in the world, bar none, still, without any question, that we ought to be able to start just winding down some of the on-street parking, maybe. Simple way of saying, damn it, I can never find a place to park, I better get the bus. Whatever, you know. So I think something we'll come back to. Richard, you're doing something which, by definition, is helping people make easier choices that don't involve having to own a car. What's your take on what I would have thought was pretty straightforward for many people? It's a damn expensive thing to see rotting and rusting outside your front door most of the time.
isn't it? So, to your point, Steve, about us talking on a website about restraining car use and why are we using that sort of language, your implied question. We have spent, I think we'll all agree here then, we've spent the last 70 years predominantly privileging the car. Not necessarily by design, actually, in some ways, but that's what's happened. That's the outturn, and sometimes most definitely by design. And the crucial thing is we're still doing it, by and large. And therein an enormous problem because greenhouse gas emission figures don't lie, they're just facts, and transports are at the same level they were in 1990 before even you were a minister, unlike more or less every other sector. Yeah. So transport has found in the last sort of 5 to 10 years in particular, it's emerged as this real sort of problem child there, and it's looking pretty exposed. And every study you care to look at points to a need to reduce mileage of cars. No matter what heroic glide path you set yourself on for EV transition or hydrogen or wherever that zero tailpipe for car option may be, you still need to be reducing mileage. West of England Combined Authority report a couple of weeks ago, 40% cut in their area by, I think, 2030 or 2035. So the scale of the challenge is enormous. So it is, I think, about restraining private car use, and we should be honest and upfront about that. But it is also simultaneously about providing people with options. However, I think if all we're doing is providing options, all we're doing is sort of polishing our carrots and having more carrots and juicier carrots, more organic carrots and more available carrots and cheaper carrots and so on, that will get us further, but it won't get us all of where we need to go. And I think that isn't just a greenhouse gas emission argument, it's also a quality of air, a quality of place argument. You know, find me the person who wants to go on holiday to somewhere that is supercar dominated and spend their time hanging out next to a motorway or at a massive roundabout or and so on. Of course not, we all want to go to places that actually aren't dominated by cars. And there are good reasons for that. So, you know, we can get so far in the sort of gentle, permissive policy space we've been in so far. My own sector is a classic illustration of that. Giving evidence to the Transport Select Committee in a couple of weeks. We did that 20 years ago. There were 1,000 car club members in this country then. There are about 850,000 now. But 33 million private cars, which has leapt ahead from I must look up actually the 20-year-old figure, but it's significantly below 33 million. So in other words, it's just not working in that sense. You know, and we have to be honest that we're going to have to do something more than simply have positive provision of the sustainable options, vital as that is. Car parking space is a classic of it. You look at the spatial planning rules in this country, they still are far too lax on amount of car parking space allowed, even demanded by planners, actually, in lots of developments. If you build it in, it will come. That's true as for cars as it is for bikes, as it is for walking.
Is this a situation where I absolutely agree with everything you say, except it doesn't apply to me? You see what I mean? Yes, of course I get the general proposition, but I actually have my car because I need to do X, Y, and Z, I think is what I'm saying.
So I think
this is part of the issue. You know, I think
absolutely.
we can all agree in principle, but when it comes to practice, not me, Gov.
Absolutely. So there's a lot in that. And that is actually, I turn that into an argument for why the simple positive provision is not enough. Look at my street in Zone 3, South East London. There's a lot of cars on it. We've got excellent car club provision, got pretty good public transport, not as amazing as you might think given we're in Zone 3, but you can't say it's terrible. We can walk places and so on, and yet. So there's a logical point there, people are using those things for a reason. There's also a big just sort of inertia, cultural mindset, pride, identification, all sorts of psychological aspects to it. And not all of those can be magically eradicated by making parking on street more difficult, as you raised earlier, or introducing permitting or ramping the price or so on. But you do have those levers to grab if you want to grab them.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me that the whole idea around the car club, for example, is one that ought to appeal, not least economically, particularly to younger people for whom the idea that the car is somehow the first thing you buy when you've got the money to do it, even before you buy a home, you know, is no longer at all relevant. Even the age at which people achieve their driving licenses extended by about 6 years over the last 15. So I mean, I think that element is very, very attractive. I think the idea, as I say, of saying, and this is because we actually need to reduce the number of vehicles in circulation, we need to reduce their use, we need to reduce their impact, is great, but it's not me, Gov. Just
to put it another way, if you talk to car club operators about this, And our research with users finds again and again, people using Car Club, they go on and use public transport more than they used to, walking and cycling more than they used to. So it's a wheel of stuff they're using. It's not just one thing, as we all, it's intuitive if you stop and think about it. But if you talk to operators about where would be viable, then they will be looking at all sorts of things, but they'll absolutely be looking at the private car picture and what parking is like. So their questions would be about, well, what restraint is there on private car parking and movement? What's that like? And if it's unfettered, or if a new development, for example, is being built with 1.5 to 2.5 free car parking spaces per dwelling, it's probably not going to work for them. Because they're on commercial risks, they're largely not subsidised. They just won't go there. Yeah. So that's one test, I think, of how does this stuff actually pan out in the real world if you're doing nothing but the positive. Yeah.
Christine, I mean, in London, the current mayor is seen as being very much anti-car. He's an anti-car man, doesn't like cars, wants to get rid of cars, as almost a kind of political issue, a kind of an attack on the bourgeoisie, who are the owners of cars, whereas we in the working class, we have the trots, we wouldn't dream of owning a car. It's a difficult balance, in my view, because I appreciate there's a need to take measures to improve air quality and so on and so forth. Are you comfortable with the way things like LTN debate is progressing and the ULEZ action, including the judicial review and even 20's plenty on major streets, which really irritates the hell out of Londoners who get caught doing 23 and a 20 limit? I mean, ludicrous nonsense. Everybody goes on the speed awareness course and comes away and says, what the was all that about? Take me through it.
That was quite the devil's advocate setup for me, wasn't it?
Well, that's it, you see.
So I think what we have in London, we have a mayor's transport strategy which sets out really clearly what we're trying to achieve and doesn't use any of that language. And so I think what's really important is that we don't start couching this in these kind of warring terms about being anti-car. What's really clear and what comes throughout that transport strategy is that we're about being pro-people. And actually, the dominance of motorised transport is not particularly pro-people. It causes severance, there are air pollutants, there's carbon emissions, there's noise, there's road safety issues. It doesn't make for good quality of life. It slows down your public transport, it increases delay and cost, and it prevents people from being able to make other choices. As we've already heard, people don't feel able to walk. They want their kids to walk or cycle to school if they're in heavily trafficked areas. And if you said to most people, where do you want to live in London? They wouldn't say, I'd really love to be by a busy road in a heavily trafficked area. That's not what most people want. So I think it's really important then when we talk about taking finite road space and trying to use it in the most efficient way possible for a sustainable city. And that might mean reducing car use and reducing car dominance. That doesn't mean that we're anti-car. What it means is that you're pro-choice, pro-quality of life, pro-people actually being able to make the choices that they want to make and make healthier and more sustainable decisions. And I think we've talked a little bit about carbon, and if we're ever going to meet anything like net zero, we need to do things differently. And I think we're trying to look at a sustainable way of doing that. You talked about people hating it, Londoners hating it, anti-car, and I think, again, it's really important that we don't think about people as motorists or drivers. And actually, using your example, Richard, there are people in London who own cars, but they also walk and they cycle and they take buses and they use the tube. And it's really important, I think, not to go down a route of kind of pitting people against each other, because we all need to move about. We all want to have good quality of life. Actually, when you talk about things like LTNs, 15-minute cities, things that can be quite, the commentary around them can get quite heightened. But when you're actually talking about would people prefer to live very far away from schools and local amenities and parks, most people wouldn't. People want to live with those kind of things near them and around them and have the ability to access them sustainably and easily and locally. So I think really this is about a quality of life issue, and we need to look at how we're doing that. And as you say, bring people with us. And I think it can very easily become quite kind of polarised. And that's what I'd really like to see us trying to move away from, because it's not ideological. It's kind of really well thought through and well evidenced, and we see it in other cities. And so I think the language that we use is really important, and I'd like to kind of see us moving away from this very polarised debate.
Yeah, I mean, it's of course, nobody would be silly enough to say what they really meant in any of these policy documents. We know that. That's called politics. I mean, the real truth is that if you ask anybody in London, even ironically among his own sort of natural audience, and they'd say the current mayor is very clearly anti-car, in a way which ironically Ken Livingstone wasn't particularly. He was very much in favour of us trying to move to active travel, which, you know, as I say, I think any sensible person is. But it's the extent to which we seem to be being openly aggressive about car ownership. I mean, the classic example in this case in London, of course, is ULEZ, where the mayor doesn't tax me because my car's, you know, new enough that it doesn't comply, because I'm rich enough to own one. He does tax poor people for being poor. And, you know, that sort of thing, I'm sorry to say, it's all very well to say, you know, you can't you know, be over-aggressive in this sort of language, and I wish we weren't. But that's an extraordinary proposition, isn't it? How does anybody justify charging people for being poor?
Okay, I'm really going to have to take issue with some of that because it's not kind of factually correct. So ULEZ is not about...
What part of it is not factually correct?
I'll start. So part of it, first of all, the poorest people in London are the least likely to own cars. So it's not true that ULEZ taxes poor people. They're the most likely to suffer from the impacts of poor air quality, and they're the least likely to own a car. ULEZ is set around emission standards, so it's not necessarily about the newness of your car, it's about the Euro standards. So a petrol car can be, you know, now getting on probably towards 18 years old before it's non-compliant. Since 2005, petrol cars are
Well, 2007, 8 and 9s are still Euro 5s. Don't qualify.
And it's different for diesels. Anyway, we can go, the emission standards are there, but it's certainly not the case that you need to have a brand new car in order to be ULEZ compliant.
Of course not.
And we see now that of the vehicles that are driving in that zone, 9 out of 10 of those cars are already compliant with the scheme. So this is about actually a tail end of vehicles that are disproportionately polluting and that have the biggest impact on people who are vulnerable to those disbenefits. So it's not the case that this is a tax, and it's not the case that it impacts the poor the most.
Well, who do you think owes these 10% of vehicles that still don't comply?
I think it's across a whole range of people. I mean, we don't have that data about, you know, which vehicles are registered to which people, but we do know that the poorest people in London are the least likely to own a car. So
well,
there will
that's
be
kind
people,
of logical.
Yeah, but there will be people who have newer diesel cars and older diesel cars and older petrol cars. I think it's going to be very difficult to kind of pick out who owns which vehicles, and we've done impact assessments and we've looked at all of that. But that's going to vary. But what we've also introduced is that there's a £110 million scrappage scheme, which is there to support the people on the lowest incomes and on disability, which means that you can take a scrappage payment, which will support you if you either do rely on a vehicle, which we recognise that some people do, and you'll be able to buy a replacement vehicle. But what we've also done this time is introduced a lower scrappage amount, which also gives people a kind of travel credit. And what we saw from the last scrappage scheme was that a third of people who gave up their cars didn't buy a new one. 22% of them no longer had access to a car in their household. We saw use of sustainable modes go up and use of cars go down. So actually we are able to support people on lower incomes through the scrappage scheme if they do have a non-compliant vehicle to either get a compliant one or give them subsidised options that mean that they can use shared mobility, that there are options in there where we can actually kind of do some subsidising of different options for people, including public transport, shared mobility, cargo bikes, e-bikes, you know, the full gamut. And actually, we have seen with the last version of that scrappage scheme that was really successful in helping people make more sustainable choices.
Just remind us what the scrappage allowance is.
It's £2,000 for a car, £5,000 for a van.
So if it's £2,000 for a car, how much do you reckon you'd have to spend to go from a Euro 5 or to a Euro
that's pegged
6?
against, that's enough to buy a compliant vehicle.
Wow.
Steve, if I go back to your line of questioning, because it was fascinating for three reasons at least. So one was the sort of the way that you distorted the distortion that went with it, which was the idea that you've got a mayor who's definitely anti-car, and your words were, you ask anyone in London. Well, that's obviously not true.
No, I can probably find 2 or 3 people.
Secondly, you, as part of that distortion, you also contradicted yourself because you said that the mayor's a trot who's all for the working class, and then you said he's all for taxing the poor. But it's a good example of the way the rhetoric escalates. And also the fact is that in order to put policies like this in place that are evidence-based around agreed emission categories, you do need to draw boundaries, and you do need to see things that can absolutely be interpreted and will be felt as being anti-car, but that doesn't mean they're anti-car. that they're trying to achieve something that Steve Gooding at the RAC Foundation, put in a preface to an RAC report a couple of months ago. If we were to achieve net zero, yes, in theory, we could get there without traffic reduction. It would be like climbing Everest on a bad day. Yeah. So the RAC Foundation, not Sustrans, basically says we need to reduce traffic to get to net zero. So if we can't do something like ULEZ, how are we going to get there? Because it's going to be really hard, because electric cars aren't going to get us there alone. But I actually want to go to the second point, which is, actually let's go back to what this is about, which is about walking and cycling, and about how do we get to a 50% target. So again, coming to your mayoral example, you've actually had 3 mayors, one of whom was a motoring correspondent for the Times, and so I don't think you can call Boris anti-car. And you had 3 mayors who provided consistent political leadership around wanting to increase cycling and to a certain extent walking in London. And it's no surprise that over the last 20 years, and Christina will have the facts I'm sure, what you've seen is an increase in walking and cycling that puts the rest of the UK in the shade. And I was involved in early walking cycling strategy in 2006, and I remember you'd go talk to people about this and you'd go, well, London's not Copenhagen, it's not Amsterdam, you can't do that here. And now you go elsewhere in the country, well, we're not London, you can't do that here, because the change has now happened. And the point I want to make is that actually political leadership, 3 political mayors with doubtless different attitudes towards car use, different motivations of different political colours, have shown consistent political leadership. And that is, if we're going back to the exam question, is the 50% target achievable? With political leadership, with consistency, yes. You see that also in Scotland, where the Scottish government for the last 10 years has actually been increasing investment, has enabled local authorities to plan to develop capability in that area, because it's different to build walking, cycling infrastructure, and you're starting to see real change happen on the ground in Scotland. So that bit about consistency, which you can also start to see in some with devolved mayors, and not even devolved mayors, Leicester, not that far from here. Again, a drip, drip, drip of change. So it takes political leadership and consistency to get that change, and then you will get it. So I think it's achievable. And the last point on that is that, unfortunately, political leadership's a double-edged sword. And what we've seen a few weeks ago, smuggled out in the announcement of delays to RIS and delays to HS2, was a 2/3 cut in funding for Active Travel England, and you could see Active Travel England as sort of the culmination of the work that you started with DFT taking walking cycling seriously, and their budget was cut by 2/3 for no apparent reason, and that's a real backward step in terms of both consistency, and it shows the fickleness of political leadership, unfortunately.
No, funny enough, see, I agree with that entirely, and I also agree with your point that all 3 mayors have been keen to promote active travel. They've been keen to, in a sense, offer people those sort of options, which have been taken up very, very well in London, particularly. I think the key, really, with the current mayor is much more of an aggressive stance. Things like LTNs, which are completely new, supposed to be in response
are actually largely the boroughs rather than TfL.
Yeah, but I mean, they're clearly with TfL's backing very strongly. Mayor's always made that clear. The ULEZ extension to a part of London that doesn't have the kind of public transport network that Inner London does, that taxes poor people for being poor, rather than, actually, ironically, taxing people who can afford it. All of that sort of senses, that's why I think the issue is, do we have to be too aggressively anti-car to get to where we are? Because actually, in some ways, what you say, Zoe, is something I entirely agree with, that you can get there without actually making enemies of the motorist. That's just, in a way, it's a dumb thing to do.
Can I jump in? I think we can hope we can get there without making enemies of the motorist, but we can't get there to the Everest point without doing something serious about car use. And if you portray Mayor Khan as being seriously anti-car, then we don't actually have a seriously anti-car mayor in this country, I don't think. You think this is sort of a huge tank-on-lawn sort of operation. I would like ULEZ and to be a part of a broader package that actually would be more about restraining car use. Is actually rather too permissive on car use in some ways. I was heartened to hear Christina point to the package of support offers. I would love to see TfL promote that much harder. I think, unfortunately, the comms around ULEZ is still very much around, if you haven't got a compliant vehicle, go and get one that is. Whereas actually, I would take it as much more if you haven't got a compliant vehicle, and if you have, here is the good moment to think about the other range of options you can be using. And yes, there are problems with it, as there are with every scheme. There is a regression problem in particular, as you will always get with a taxation-based scheme. But how do we think we're going to get there? It's going to be some change. We can't get there doing what we're already doing, because we can look at all the graphs and see that. There are plenty of other mayors that have targets and achieved targets of taking out X% of car parking spaces across the entire city per year for multiple years, who have brought in registration of people having to register to park their own cars on their own drives. There's all sorts of things we could be, much further than what's actually happening, in London right now. I think I'd like to come back to Xavier's consistency point, because people talk about Amsterdam or Copenhagen, as he raised, and so on. The Amsterdam of the early 1970s was a horrible place from a quality of life, quality of air perspective, road safety perspective, and so on. It wasn't at all the city that you can go and visit today. And the reason there's such a gap between those two things is because they set about doing things differently and then kept at it. And this is where, certainly in my world and Xavier's world, if I can describe it like that, we are back where you were as a transport minister in the 1990s, I would argue. I remember hearing you speak very interestingly about the Jubilee Line extension, the craziness you inherited of in-year budget cuts to a major capital engineering infrastructure programme. And here we are with the in-year cut to active travelling. Whereas I feel like we've learned those lessons with public transport infrastructure. We've learned that, no, that is not a good way to go and do it. So that's why we don't do it like that anymore. And it's a basic point that we need to get into in active travel, shared travel, sustainable travel, outside public transport, basically.
I don't think any of us thinks that the cut in the active travel budget was either sensible or justifiable on any basis. I mean, the irony is that it's only with some money that you can achieve the thing that we all want, which is to see people choosing active travel as a natural alternative. And I think, that's the point, Christina, that I'm sort of trying to make. I think, there's a very fine line between frustration theory, let's make it really, really tough for motorists, which is a way, I suppose, of trying to reduce car use. I suspect none of us are motorists any more than we're voters or drinkers or whatever else we might be. We're simply citizens. It's that subtle balance that you've got to be able to ride that allowed two very different mayors in Ken and Boris, for example, both to achieve something quite significant in terms of active travel. And that's, I suppose, where I come from. I
just want to pick up on that balance point, because I think it's being presented a little bit like previous mayors have
been good, and this one's
investing
no good,
in active travel, and this one is just kind of with his anti-car policies. And there are policies, as we've talked around car use, and particularly around air quality, but that's hand in hand with investment in active travel and in infrastructure. And we've seen huge increases in the level of infrastructure and in the people who are walking and cycling. And I think that's something that we should spend a bit more time talking about as well. It's actually who's doing it. And what we have seen in London is, particularly over the last few years, and this was slightly, related to the pandemic, was that we've seen a huge broadening in the people who are walking and particularly cycling, which wasn't particularly diverse. And I think it's really important that we look at both sides of this equation, that we're also looking at how we can kind of grow that and make sure that there are more people who feel able to make those choices. And we know that in London, there's been a kind of a well-founded narrative of, men in Lycra using cycle infrastructure. And we did see a lot of growth in cycling, predominantly in that demographic. But actually now what we're seeing is that more people are more likely to be choosing to walk and cycle. And we want to really be focusing on that, I think. So we're doing a lot of work with community groups to make sure that actually we are putting in infrastructure, not just where there's existing demand, but where people might want to travel, where there's interest, but people haven't felt able to. And actually working with community groups, because it's incredibly powerful if you see somebody like you cycling, and that means that there are more people who feel more able to do it. And I think that's something that we should kind of not lose sight on either, that this isn't just about absolute numbers, if you like. It's also about who's doing it, how we're doing it, and broadening that appeal. And I think that is something that we have seen success on, and we've spent time and money on, and we're continuing to do that, and we're going to have a focus on that in our new cycle action plan. And that is also something that's been really important to this mayor and as part of this transport strategy.
Yeah. Tell me, just before we finish, we very much concentrated on London, and I think that's justifiable because that's where most of the progress has been made, where most of the issues sort of coalesce and, you know, are probably felt more strongly, both positively and negatively, than they are in the rest of the country. But just thinking, you mentioned, Shelby, I know you were talking about Leicester. Bristol, of course, has been a place, York, Oxford, Cambridge, all very much more pro-cycling right early on, and a very different kind of cycling, incidentally, not the lycra-clad, you know, sort of helmeted 23 gears stuff, but actually just simply sit up and beg with a pannier in front and people not even bothering to put a helmet on. Is there a lot more that can be done outside London where perhaps the issue is seen as being less acute?
There has to be. So to go back to the 50% target, I mean, you're not going to get there through London. It's got to be got in the towns and cities across England, and that is an England target. And I've mentioned Scotland, and there's good stuff going on in Wales as well. So you've seen a huge change in Cardiff, for example, the infrastructure's going in. But I think that to Christina's point about sort of the type of user, it's also about the type of journeys. And so workplace parking, fine, but the majority of short trips aren't for work. They're for education, leisure, shopping. But historically, transport planners have tended to be men in grey suits and you know, in an office at work and have thought in that way. When actually we need to think about those other journeys, which actually often are riper for being walked or cycled, and ensuring we're planning for those. And so some of that, so it does need to happen in our towns and cities, which is why actually the cut to Active Travel England funding is so disappointing, because that would go out to towns and not just the devolved authorities who through the Devo deals. This is additional money on top of that. And then the other, so I think making those shorter those journeys other than the work trip journeys, which is why LTNs or you know, livable neighbourhoods, whatever we want to call them, are actually really important, because that's where people live. And if people can't cycle from their front door, then that's really problematic. And so things like an England-wide ban on pavement parking, which is there in London, going back to London, is needed, because if you literally can't walk down your street or wheel down your street, what hope is there of walking longer journeys? So I think, but there are definite examples of where there's success, and again, it comes down to political leadership. Leicester's had that consistency, drip, 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 and we're starting to see positive change across the country. So it's back to the exam question. I'm certainly hopeful that we'll get to the 50%.
Yeah. Richard, your experience is, I suppose, pretty similar in terms of outside London.
It's been really interesting. I've been in this job 4 years coming up next month, and in that time I've seen some parts of England in particular, I would say, actually take some pretty big leaps forward. It's not uniform by any means. There's a big coordination problem, helping them learn from each other, something we try and do a bit. There's a big unmet need there, though, still, and so on. So I'm not trying to say it's been perfect, but it's been encouraging. And they are generally the ones who have got something to build on in the first place in terms of density, in terms of car dominance, in terms of historic patterns of behaviour, but not just that. And I think it's one of the better things that have happened the last few years has been some funding streams and setting of rules, although nothing like enough, and there's some more exciting stuff hopefully in the pipeline on it with local transport plans and so on, that require them to think plurally, try and do more than one thing at once, and try and do something significant. Those sort of three things coming together. And so you've seen some places perhaps a little bit unlikely, dare I say, you know, Norwich, Bournemouth, Christchurch, Poole. I wouldn't, coming into the role, have picked out those as sort of enormous hotspots of sustainable transport activity, but actually they've been up to a heck of a lot in the last half decade. And it has to be, to Xavier's point, of course it has to be on the numbers, but also just on the sort of moral equity case for it. We can't have a sort of chunks of the country delivering on being nice and therefore lower emissions, and actually we've just given up on the rest.
Yeah. I mean, in terms of strategy, Christina, it struck me that one of the issues that separates London from the rest of the country is that, you know, central area parking is incredibly expensive. And perfectly, that's commercial. That's just a commercial decision. I've got a parking space. If you really want it, I'm going to charge you for it. And yet when I go around the country to other provincial cities, parking is really very cheap relatively, particularly when the car costs the same, the fuel costs the same, and so on, you know. Do you think there are particular issues outside London which maybe London, you know, has learned lessons that could be translated to other towns and cities?
Yeah, so we do work closely with other cities, and we do try and share examples of best practice which work, you know, and always talking about, you know, workplace parking. We've talked to Nottingham, learned from their examples. there as well. So there are different people do different things well, and I think it's really important that we keep that dialogue up between cities, because this isn't, it's really important that we do work together, and that's the only way that we're going to achieve any of these stretching targets.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm very sorry to say this is a completely self-indulgent session, as you probably gathered, so my apology for that. Secondly, there were some questions, but we've had a rather truncated session, sadly. We're about 10 minutes short of the time that it would have been nice to have. So I'm afraid we won't be able to answer any of those questions, but they were all, one of them was on the cutting grant, which we certainly covered and we all agree. One of them was indeed about what do we do outside London. And I'm sorry if you didn't get a direct answer, but no doubt you can talk to any of our panelists or indeed to me if you'd like to after the session. And what I do think is that you've got 3 terrific panelists here. They've been absolutely marvellous. So please do give them a big hand and thank them for their contribution. Yes. Very good. Really good.